Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on decarbonising heat and the role for flexibility. This is the third and final webinar in our Future Energy Systems series with experts discussing how can a flexible energy system help deliver net zero. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to attendees after the webinar. I would now like to introduce today's first presenter, Andrew Lever from the Carbon Trust.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in a three-part series that explores the role of flexibility in the Great Britain energy system. Thank you to all of those who've joined across all three webinars, and indeed those who are joining today for the first time. We've had over approaching 450 attendees across the whole series, which give you a sense of the interest in this topic, of course. My name's Andrew Lever, and I'm Director at the Carbon Trust, and I lead our work in energy systems. I'm also pleased to introduce Keith Owen, Chair of the Hydrogen Working Group at the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers, or IGEM, today, and also to Matt Watson, the Innovation and Low Carbon Networks Engineer at Western Power Distribution. Today's theme will explore the decarbonising pathways towards heat and the role of flexibility in doing that. We'll start with an introduction to flexibility and a brief overview of our Flexibility in Great Britain project, which is underway at the moment. And then we'll hear from today's speakers, Keith and Matt, who will share their work and perspectives on flexibility. And then we'll flow into discussion chaired by Hannah Evans from the Carbon Trust. And as you heard already, there will be an opportunity to submit questions during the discussion through the chat function, and we'll look to cover those through the discussion session. So what is flexibility and why do we need it? Well, as you may be aware of Ofgem's definition here on the chart, says that it's about modifying generation and or consumption patterns in reaction to an external signal, such as a change in price, to provide a service within the energy system. I guess another perspective is that flexibility fundamentally allows us to do more with less. And this is increasingly important as we transition to net zero, of course, and become increasingly reliant upon more intermittent forms of generation, more local forms of generation, and also adapt to changes in demand patterns and in vectors, be that across electric vehicles and alternative ways in which we heat our homes and our businesses. Flexibility, of course, allows network operators to reduce or defer reinforcement costs. It allows greater use of renewable generation capacity. Flexibility improves system stability and reliability. And coming back to that assertion that it allows us to do more with less, particularly it allows us to meet net zero in a more cost-effective manner, and that's of course very important, given the substantial amount of investment and efforts that will be required to transition towards that net zero future. So we know flexibility can add value. Carbon Trust, as you may know, published two reports, 2016 on the value of flexibility to the electricity system, and also a least regrets approach to investment in flexibility. And these reports provided a clear articulation of the value of flexibility in the future energy system, and gave some insights into the kind of optimal portfolio of technologies given uncertainties in system development. Now, of course, since 2016, the decarbonisation of heat and transport sectors have come kind of into the crosshairs of policy and much more into focus. And given these developments, we've seen an increased interest across the sector in understanding the role and value of flexibility. Of course, what we don't know now, and what we want to explore is, how much more valuable flexibility is in meeting net zero, compared to 12, 18 months ago, where we were just looking at an 80% reduction in carbon. How flexibility across gas and electricity networks, interacts, and we've got two great speakers today that will give us those perspectives, and we'll be able to explore that further in the discussion. Yeah, and equally, of course, the role of flexibility in decarbonising heat and transport sectors. And importantly, and this is the one which really will drive a lot of investment, is what are those new commercial business models that are required for flexibility to help meet net zero? How do we invest? How do revenue streams run? And what do those business models look like? So to address these questions, as I mentioned at the start, we have commenced a project looking at flexibility in Great Britain. In short, the aims here, as you can see on the slide, are to develop that robust evidence base to support the continued deployment of flexible technologies in a cost-effective way. And that evidence base is important to provide direction to industry and to policymakers on the role of flexibility as part of that cost-effective transition. And a part of that, of course, as I mentioned already, is to really explore the business models and the requirements that need to be met to make them deliverable and viable, be that suggestions on policy and regulatory developments, etc. As you can see here at the bottom of the slide, we've convened a wide range of kind of cross-vector and sector stakeholders to support, including Western Power Distribution, Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, Institution of Gas and Engineering Managers, of course, EDF, UK Power Networks, Scottish Power Energy Networks, Bright Energy, SPM Offshore, Statera Energy, and the Greater London Authority. In addition to that, we've also set up an external stakeholder group, which includes the various and relevant departments at BEIS, Ofgem, the Committee on Climate Change, the National Infrastructure Commission, and the National Grid ESO. We're doing that to be very keen to align with, of course, with current policy and regulatory efforts and developments that have been done in this area, as well as ensuring our evidence can be impactful and helpful. We are supported by Imperial College London, who we've worked with on previous projects and will be providing modelling support. Project's already commenced and will be concluding 9 or so months' time by March 2021. So I'm now very pleased to hand over to Keith from iGEM to share his perspectives on heat and flexibility. Keith, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, Keith Owen, I'm Head of Systems Development and Energy Strategy for Northern Gas Networks, but importantly, in terms of this project, I represent the industry through iGEM as Chair of the Hydrogen Committee. So I've got around about 3 slides to quickly run through, give you an understanding of what GB industry is up to, where we're headed, and hopefully that gives some insight into how collaboration between gas and electricity systems in particular is really important in order that as a nation we hit net zero as described by legislation. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So a little bit about iGEM. Like many institutes, iGEM's been around for a very long time, 1863 in fact, which is amazing for any organisation to be that old. And it's the primary institute for professional development and so on for the gas industry, and as such, an awful lot of what we do is governed by iGEM standards. There's just over 70 plus iGEM standards, which have afforded us in the UK with really a world-class gas system that has evolved over many decades, and is certainly the envy of many countries, I suspect, in terms of resilience and capability. Importantly, iGEM are very active in understanding how this same gas system, which transitioned from what was Towns gas back in the 60s to natural gas, how that can then evolve to be a low zero carbon energy system of the future and enable the UK to progress towards net zero. And as such, whilst they have within RGM a number of internal groups looking at gas quality and my own committee, which is looking at decarbonisation through hydrogen, RGM are actively involved across various industry groupings, working with BEIS and academia and so on, in order that we get the very best insight from an industry perspective across all of those areas. So, as I say, important institute and a key component of what industry do in the UK. So if you move to the next slide, please. Little sprint through what, as an industry, we've been doing and continue to do. So over the last few years, we've been developing our thinking around how you might transition from a fossil fuel dominant system conveying natural gas from all parts of the UK to where it's needed. How you transition that to one which is conveying low carbon gases, green gases in the future. On that basis, we've seen a number of reports come out, such as those from the Committee on Climate Change and so on, which have started to talk increasingly about the role of hydrogen in the system and how that might enable the sort of transition that we want to see. And of course, we immediately start to see some interfaces across both transport and the electricity sector when we start to include hydrogen in the mix, much more than perhaps we've got at the moment. So recently we've launched Gas Goes Green. It's a piece of work through the Energy Networks Association. You can see the links there. Recommend, if you've not heard of that, to go onto that website and explore what lies within. There are 6 work streams. I'll not go through those in detail, but the fundamental principle is one of very significant collaboration right across our industry. So all of the major networks cooperate and share learning and are working with ENA to drive this Gas Goes Green program of work. What we've also got running alongside Gas Goes Green are projects which have been around for a little while now. They're listed at the bottom there, again with links to the various websites that they have. And these are very significant pieces of work across the UK, multi-million-pound projects, each and every one of them, trying to understand what the technical challenges are and overcome those technical challenges to transition from a system, as I say, which is conveying natural gas to one which is 100% hydrogen or blended hydrogen in the mix. So very quickly running through those from left to right, my own network, Northern Gas Networks, leads the H21 program, website h21.green, and that is looking at how we might repurpose our existing infrastructure. How can we use what we've already got and push hydrogen through it, and what might need to change, and just to what level might those impacts be. So really a significant piece of work. We've more or less completed phase 1 now of that project, which was looking at leakage and consequence of failure. Now, we're now moving towards the testing in a real sense through a microgrid that we're building, with the objective that eventually we move towards in a year or two towards live trials of hydrogen for heat in the domestic setting. And that works really closely with our colleagues in Scotia who have a similar project, H100, looking at how you can convey gas into consumers' property. They're both working in tandem with the High for Heat programme, which is a government-led £25 million research piece to develop hydrogen appliances. So you can see straight away that these projects are very much looking at different elements of the challenge, but working hand in glove with one another to make sure that we really get the best possible outcomes for all of this work. Equally, we've got colleagues at National Grid working on high NTS, which is looking at the different technical challenges around conveying hydrogen at a high pressure system, which brings different sorts of issues to overcome to what you might see at a domestic level. We've got HyNet, which is looking at, through Cadent, was looking at the application of hydrogen in the industrial space, albeit linked into degrees of transport and also the domestic. And the one that sort of stands out, I suppose, is a different approach. Whereas those I've just quickly sprinted through are all talking about 100% hydrogen and a comprehensive move away from natural gas, HyDeploy is looking at the blended solution. So that's, if you like, a forerunner. It's part of the pathway to a decarbonised energy system, where we can blend up to 20% hydrogen in the natural gas system in order to, one, decarbonise, but do so in a way that has absolutely no impact on consumer appliances and their everyday life. So we're not changing anything at that point, other than the mix. We're changing the gas quality, if you like. That's more or less finished at Keele University, which was phase 1. It's transitioning to phase 2 at the moment, and that will be based up in our Integral facility in Gateshead, where we look to further the evidence and further the technical aspects of HyDeploy, working with 670 gas consumers in that area. And then that will flow down to Cadence Patch in order that they do the same. And then just to close out, of course, any changes to gas quality affect the billing, and the Future Billing Methodology project has been looking at how we might change our billing process in order to enable a greener gas grid in the future. So just to close out then, if you move to the next slide, please. This is a bit of a vision piece, I suppose. It gives you an idea of some of the thinking. There are no right answers, obviously, but this gives an idea of perhaps the direction of travel that we might see. So at the moment, that's a quick, simple overview of 2020, where we've got some big industrial clusters. We've got our gas grids, both at a national level and a distribution level, and the electricity grid is seeing a lot of penetration of renewables, particularly from wind. And we've got a little bit of green gas there through biomethane. With the work that we're carrying out through those projects I mentioned, we move to the next step, 2025. What we're hoping to achieve by that period is we'll have successfully carried out consumer trials at below 7 bar level, so distribution level of 100% hydrogen. The HyDeploy project will have closed out all of the necessary findings, and blending is becoming an established process, so less project, more business as usual. And we start to see a growing set of infrastructure looking at hydrogen refueling, particularly for the large fleet, HGVs and trains and so forth. And what we expect to see through some of the projects that we're aware of are carbon capture, utilization and storage capability starting to become a normal operation within our large industrial clusters. So we move to the next slide, please. So it's 2020-30 now. And really, given what I've just gone through, we would expect to see that those pilots, that initial work starting to materialize into really large-scale pilots of 100% hydrogen for heat. We'd start to see pretty major blending operations, perhaps at a national level, where the whole concept of utilizing the gas grid to store energy from an electricity grid, provide balancing services to provide that relatively low cost service to the electricity system as more and more green renewables come on stream. That becomes very much an enabler, which benefits both the electricity system and the gas infrastructure in the whole decarbonisation narrative. So really important that we see that happen. We'll start to see the industrial clusters producing hydrogen too, as part of their own decarbonisation strategies, and potentially that's a new source of hydrogen that can tap into the gas grid. So if we move to the next slide, please. The idea here, by 2040, we've commenced the rollout in the early 30s of widespread conversion to hydrogen across GB. And in this particular scenario, what we're talking about is front loading an awful lot of that in the first decade in order that we can really drive that accelerated net zero position for the UK, really set the UK apart from elsewhere in terms of first adopter and all the advantages that that would bring. That would then leaves us just on the last slide to close out in a position from 2040 to 2050 where there's some reconciliation of what we've done, working closely with our electrical colleagues to make sure that we've got the highest levels of resilience, lowest cost options for our customers, and what we're delivering is an amazing net zero energy delivery system in its entirety that has fundamental principles around sustainable green energy at its heart. So that's a very quick sprint through some of the thinking that's going on, and I'd be really keen to engage in a conversation about that at the end of these slides. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you, Keith, for setting out that plan. Next, I'd just like to hand over to Matt Watson from Western Power Distribution. Over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks. So yeah, as Andrew said, I'm Matt Watson from the innovation team at WPD. And yeah, I'm going to give you a quick overview on who WPD are and our views on flexibility and heat, and then hopefully that should stimulate some good questions as we get into the discussion session. So just as a quick overview, and I'd hope most people are aware of this, but WPD are the largest DNO in the UK by area. We cover 4 of the 14 distribution licenses in the UK, covering the South West, South Wales, East and West Midlands, and serve about 7.8 million customers. And you know, our traditional role as a DNO has been to sort of keep the lights on, operate an efficient network, sort of maintain that network, fix the network if it got damaged, and then connect new customers and reinforce where needed. And as you are all aware, the world is changing. The sources of generation are changing, the way customers want to use energy is changing, and the technology available is changing. And inherently the aim of all the constraints around how we need to operate the system are changing if we're going to hit decarbonisation targets and net zero. And as such, we are involved in significant changes in the way we do things, often framed in the transition to DSO, so distributed system operator, which is all about how we start to run a much more active network. So we move away from the sort of passive network of taking electricity from transmission simply down to customers, but start running a much more active network. And this is about kind of taking our DNO roles and adding significant additional capability, and a lot of that is around flexibility services and non-network solutions. So trying to be sort of promote innovation in the way we do things, facilitate markets around kind of how we operate the system to give us more options around what we do, rather than just doing traditional reinforcement, but try and understand whether we can use flexibility services to help us get more out of the system. We want to drive some more competition and efficiencies in the way we do things, and do all that whilst maintaining a resilient network with high security of supply. So quite a significant challenge over the next few years. If we go to the next slide. So I then want to just talk around kind of how we view flexibility within WPD. So first thing to note is that all DNOs have now committed to the assessment of flexibility services for major reinforcement schemes. So that means, you know, whenever there's significant reinforcement, we investigate whether sort of flexibility service options would be more effective. At WPD, that means we are committed to assessing at least to 90% of our load-related reinforcement against flexibility services. So any significant scheme would fall under those categories. And the sort of WPD approach to doing to operations is often to try and sort of lead the way in terms of kind of where things are going. So our approach to flexibility has been quite similar, quite sort of akin to our standard form. So we've been we've done a number of innovation trials around flexibility services and how we do things, how we operate those. But actually, we were very keen to transition that to business as usual. So following our entire trial, where we procured services in the East Midlands, we've since expanded the flexible power brand that we created as part of that trial and transitioned it into business as usual. We've been running procurements on for flexibility service on a regular basis for the past few years. The numbers on this slide are actually slightly out of date because last week we opened up another round of procurement, but it's so I think we're now into our 6th round. They happen every 6 months. But yeah, it's again, we're looking at for about 300 megawatts of response across about 45 zones. And to give a bit of context in terms of the kind of scale of the network, it covers about over 200 of our primary network substations and about 20% of the network. So quite a significant chunk of the network is now being assessed against flexibility services, and we're actively looking to procure response. Now, traditionally, that has been focused on demand turn down services and generation turn up services. That's been kind of where things have been predominantly focused, but this round we've now actually included a zone in the Nottinghamshire area where we're looking for demand turn up, so an increase of demand under certain key times. And the key focus at the moment is primarily around kind of growing maturity and liquidity within those markets. So we acknowledge that we had to make a commitment to these. So, this is part of our main business. This is a significant part of what we do at the moment. We're trying to kind of build volume and build experience as we go. Alongside the sort of business as usual work, we're also continuing to run more innovation in the flexibility area, acknowledging that where we are is a significant step from where we were, but actually there's a lot of extra work that needs to be done. This is by no means the sort of end position of where flexibility sits. And there's a range of different projects that we are doing and other DNOs are doing in this space, from things like our S project, where we're looking at how to better forecast our requirements, to things like our Future Flex project, where we are looking at how to make services more accessible to domestic customers and how to make things more accessible there. Our Intraflex project, where we're looking at running things closer to real time in terms of our procurement of services and trying to mitigate impacts on suppliers. And then we've got trials like our MADE trial, where we're looking at sort of multiple different low carbon technologies within a single domestic premises and how they interact. And the approach is quite deliberately quite broad, acknowledging that actually the future of flexibility is relatively, or the exact endpoint is a bit uncertain, and therefore we're keen to kind of broaden our knowledge base at this stage and kind of understand what does work, what doesn't work, where the market's at, so we can really kind of continue to push forward and primarily try and get more volume involved in what we're doing. Inherently, our requirements are highly localized, and so there's the biggest challenge has always been about how do you get sufficient volume in local areas that we can have confidence that we can actually use flexibility and get decent pricing for what we're doing. The final bit on this slide is just to think about, just to acknowledge that flexibility kind of covers both sort of more active services like what we're doing under flexible power, but also more tariff-based services. So we acknowledge that there's a kind of trade-off and an interaction between the two to kind of see how we kind of get the best out of things. And so things like pricing and how that reflects across to customers has a massive impact in terms of kind of how they utilize flexibility. So we are staying aware of the wider sort of changes in the market and the sort of the conversations around market-wide half-hourly settlement, as they will have quite significant impacts in the way people utilize electricity. So if we go on to the next slide. So the final bit was just to talk around heat, how we see heat and kind of how that interacts with what we're doing on flexibility. And I think the first thing to acknowledge is that heat is a significant challenge going forward, both in its scale and just from the sheer kind of volume of energy that is required to heat homes and businesses in the UK, but also the complexity. We're fully aware of the challenges that are posed by electric vehicles, but they look comparatively simple compared to heating, where you've got far more diversity in terms of the building stock, the climatic conditions within the UK, customer preferences and everything like that. So it's quite a significant challenge around kind of working out how we go forward and what customers actually want. The other real challenge, I think, is around just the uncertainty in terms of where things are actually going to head. And I think the graph on the right highlights it fairly well. So I think as we look to decarbonise, we will change significantly from where we currently stand in terms of how we heat, and even in a sort of low electrification scenario, such as the Committee on Climate Change's more hydrogen-based scenarios, you end up with 11 million heat pumps across the UK, which will have a significant impact on our network. However, if you take their other kind of scenario around high electrification, then you end up with close to 26 million. And obviously the difference between that and the impact that has on the network is huge. And obviously those are kind of two sort of edge case scenarios. There's a good likelihood that we end up somewhere down the middle. But I think at the moment there's definitely a sort of a challenge around kind of understanding how things look and where they will look, so we can understand what we can do. Because inherently the more clarity we have, the easier it is for us to invest in our network, and the less risk there is around that. And so there's quite a few big debates around kind of how to facilitate that and balance the risk of the requirement of the change to facilitate decarbonisation without exposing customers to excessive costs and risks from investment. Obviously within this, I think it's acknowledged that flexibility will play a significant role. I think around here there's a significant lots of different ways in which flexibility can work. So obviously you've got things around sort of how what flexibility you have in when heating is required. You've got the potential to store heat within buildings, and there's some interesting work around that. But obviously there's some challenges around sort of customer requirements and how they see things there. There's also some really interesting work around kind of how we interact flexibility between the different networks, between us and the gas network. So we did our Freedom project with Wales and West Utilities in South Wales, looking at hybrid heat pumps that ran primarily on as heat pumps, but had a gas backup for either particularly cold days or days when the electricity network could be constrained. And that showed that there was significant benefits in terms of its ability to shift between both, as you could kind of get the best of both worlds to sort of maximise your decarbonisation and minimise your cost to networks. Obviously, as the makeup of the gas network changes as we kind of move to net zero, some of those findings will sort of change, and kind of how things shift between the two will be interesting. That's probably something we'll need to kind of review and kind of keep up to date. But that kind of ability to shift things between the two networks was incredibly useful. And we're also looking at various different other projects about what else we can do on our network to kind of facilitate and make things more accommodating. So we've already done things like updating our sort of minimum cable sizes. There's a few projects we're looking at where we're considering whether we can use almost use 3-phase cables as our standard for services, just to create additional capacity. And then I think the final thing to mention is just around energy efficiency and how important that then becomes in this sort of future world. Inherently, as more heat becomes electrified, suddenly the value of energy efficiency to DNO grows higher. Obviously, we aren't the only sort of people that gain value from it. And so kind of how we can facilitate that, how we can allow people sort of the value to be realised, and how we align that with wider work on energy efficiency is really interesting. And we've got a few projects across the DNOs about kind of how we might look to do that. So that's my very quick overview on flexibility and heat. If you are interested in more of that, we do have our heat pump strategy was recently published, and we do have a lot more information on what we do on flexibility on our Flexible Power website. But I think I'll leave it there for the moment.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Matt. We'll move now into the panel discussion. Just to introduce myself, my name is Hannah Evans and I work in the Energy Systems team at the Carbon Trust. I'd like to welcome our panellists, Keith Owen and Matt Watson, and say many thanks to you both for joining us today and for giving us a really great introduction to your work. If anyone would like to ask a question to our speakers, and I can see that some people have been putting forward some really great questions already, please do so in the question function, and we will try and address as many as possible in today's session. To kick off with, we'll kind of look more broadly at the challenges of transitioning to low carbon heating. The Committee on Climate Change's recent report to Parliament stated that the government must take low carbon heating from a niche market in the UK today to the dominant form of new heating installations by the early 2030s to remain on track to meeting net zero emissions. So maybe Matt, coming to you first, you mentioned in your presentation that the scale and complexity of the low carbon heating transition is large and even greater than that of rolling out low carbon transport. Given the scale of that challenge and the uncertainty associated with it, what do you see as the main challenges for networks in delivering that transition to low carbon heating?
Well, I think so. Obviously, there are a number of challenges, and I think yeah, ranging across sort of the technology needed for customers' homes, the kind of the engagement with customers, the kind of understanding of their behaviours. There's a whole load of challenges around that, and we've got plenty of trials that have highlighted that, and painful experience of how difficult some of that can be. But I think the biggest bit, I think, for me is kind of the value for me is around kind of getting clarity on where things are going. I think as I highlighted before, the kind of difference between some of the different scenarios has quite significant impacts on our networks, and I imagine it'd be similar for the gas networks. And so trying to understand where things are going, how wide how far the sort of bounds of the possible are would be useful, so that we can get clarity and kind of really understand how best to develop networks. With all these things, when you're looking to build a network, the most expensive bit is deciding to kind of make it bigger. Once you're making it slightly bigger, the sort of additional cost of additional capacity is generally relatively marginal. And so kind of what we really want to be in a position is that when we are going to networks, we kind of ensure that when we visit them and improve them, we make them kind of secure for the asset life, which tends to be 45 years. So it takes us quite a long way out. So trying to understand that sort of where things will sit, so we can kind of maximize the value of any intervention would be, I think, is probably the highest value thing for us.
Great, thank you. And Keith, would you agree with that point on having that long-term clarity of sort of policy direction, or are there additional challenges from a gas network perspective in that low carbon heat transition?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That we all look forward to the point in time where there's a very, very clear route through all of this that has the necessary government support, whichever direction or multiple directions they are, in order to drive this through. We see, we've got 30 years, I think, left, and from a utility perspective, that's kind of next week in some respect. So the sort of transitions that we're talking about are very complex. Would be extraordinarily easy to add cost to if we don't get this resolved quickly in terms of that direction. And I think importantly, speaking from the gas industry perspective, if we can secure that just enables it provides that level of confidence to the supply chain that they can invest in the necessary plant and production facilities. They can invest with confidence in the research for their future products and so on, without feeling that they end up with a whole load of stranded asset and lost capital, effectively. So I think that's very, very important. I do think, though, that so yes, there's a policy need there, and industry and government are working closely on that to establish the necessary evidence which would enable such a thing. But I do think the other element which I think was touched on is the whole conversation around our customers, both from electricity and gas perspective. We really do need to have open and positive conversations with consumers out there, both from a domestic business and industrial perspective, so that they can understand what this transition looks like and they can make the right choice for them. And that's irrespective of their, if you like, their social status, their income, or what level of, what type of vulnerability they may have. We've got to get that communication right and work with stakeholders to make sure that we can deliver on that. Because the consumer behaviour is one aspect, but just accepting a particular pathway is really important. It doesn't matter how good your technology is, if the customer doesn't want it and they don't see it as something that is good for them, you're not going to get very far. So I think there are a lot of different areas that need to be addressed here in a coordinated and a collaborative manner, which is why projects such as this with Carbon Trust, I think, are really useful and positive step forward, that we have electricity and gas having this conversation to understand what this might look like and how the benefits might be realised.
Brilliant. Thanks, Keith. And that leads really nicely actually into the next question I wanted to ask you around that kind of the theme of collaboration. I think we've had a couple of chats in the past where we've talked about the fact that it often seems that discussions around the low carbon heating transition and scenarios that relate to it often seem to kind of pit one technology against each other, either intentionally or unintentionally. So you might have a kind of very high electrification scenario or a very hydrogen dominant scenario. And what we're keen to do in this project, and I know you've mentioned you're keen to do as well, is look at how the electricity and gas networks can kind of complement each other in delivering low carbon heating and flexibility. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. So how do you think the two networks can work together in delivering low carbon heat and flexibility services?
Yeah, sure. I think we're starting to see signs of that. So there's active involvement with the Open Networks project, where you have electricity and gas teams discussing key areas, whole system solutions to our future and so on. I think we need more of that. In fact, from a regulatory perspective, there seems to be encouragement to have those conversations and develop that whole energy system thinking. That doesn't require any special incentives or so forth. It's about getting in a room and having that grown-up conversation about where a particular technology is best suited. You're quite right that it doesn't take much to have a look on LinkedIn or any other of these discussion forums, as it were, and you immediately just see there's the only solution is an EV. The only solution is a heat pump. The only solution is a hydrogen boiler, and never the twins shall meet. And it's all nonsense, really, because what we know is the scale of the challenge is so enormous. If we start heat, for instance, in the 2030s, that's 20,000 homes broadly, every single week for non-stop until we get to 2050, which is an extraordinary statistic, but that's the scale of the challenge that we face. And we get nowhere fast by arguing it's one route or another. It's all of the routes at once in order that we actually break the back of this climate challenge and set the UK on the right path. So I think firm collaboration and across industry, working with our stakeholders to understand their concerns, working with government to help them in the decisions that they undoubtedly have to make, I think is essential. As I say, we start to see more and more of that, and that's to be encouraged. And I'm sure there are going to be more projects just like this one that will help us really understand what good looks like for the UK. And if we do that, then what we do is we enable skills, IP, export potential for the UK in order to really expand our green economy and move forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Keith. And to bring Matt in on this topic, I know you touched on it in your presentation, a number of the projects that WPD have been involved in looking at low carbon heating, not just electrification of heating, but also hybrid heating. I wondered if you could expand a little bit more on those projects and just sort of more broadly around the work that you're doing to kind of understand how networks can complement each other in delivering this low carbon heating transition.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss that. I think it is really important to highlight just how much the kind of the sort of the decarbonisation or the paths and the impacts will have a sort of kind of have on one network, one set of networks, then have quite significant impacts on the others. So it is imperative that we work together to try and understand those impacts. In terms of specific projects, a couple to highlight would be potentially the Freedom Project, where we looked at the value of hydrogen, of hybrid heat pumps, and the kind of value you had for being able to switch the supply between gas and electricity, and kind of how you can optimize between both to kind of minimize carbon and minimize cost. That was a really interesting piece around kind of how you can kind of gain value from there. We've also just recently finished that was with Wales and West Utilities Massive Systems. We've also just finished another project with Wales and West Utilities and Regen on sort of on scenarios for net zero in South Wales, and kind of going into some of the detail about kind of what happens when you kind of look at that decarbonisation pathway for across both networks. So whereas traditionally we do look at scenarios and kind of almost distribution future energy scenarios on our side of things. I know the gas network do something very similar. This was looking at kind of what happens when you kind of put those together. What kind of additional benefits do you get? Does it work? What kind of bits do you need to do to make that work, and kind of what are the outcomes? And I think that was quite a useful process to kind of see how that could look. I think with all this, we kind of need a number of different projects, both on kind of across a range of different topics, to then feed back into the policymakers, so that they can, they're informed in any decisions that you then go forward with. So, a lot of our role is not necessarily to set policy, but is to create the evidence base, so that those setting policy have the best information to take forward.
Yeah. Brilliant, thanks, Matt. And I would agree with you on that. That transparency point and that information provision. I think building the evidence base so that we can make the best decisions possible is going to be key over the next kind of year or so, as we hopefully get more certainty on the pathway forward. I want to jump to sort of talking a little bit more around kind of working with sectors kind of outside of our kind of the network companies, and maybe bringing in a question from the audience. This is kind of a local authority perspective. So the question is kind of with many local authorities setting net zero targets, they're increasingly often looking towards electrification as the main strategy as it can be deployed today. How do we kind of mitigate kind of lock in towards a certain path, and potentially divergence from national policy if that's being developed later, given that kind of hydrogen developments are upcoming? I don't know, Keith, if you want to comment on that first.
Yeah, I'll certainly try. It's a really good question, and I think it is a challenging area. To be fair, even if we had all of the policies lined up and products available and all those sorts of things, 10 years to deliver net zero across the local authority landscape is incredibly challenging. You can't underestimate the level of impact that would have, the cost that would impact that would have. Perhaps more so given the situation we have with the response to COVID-19. That's not to say that we don't try to deliver that, but it's hard enough to be able to get to 2050. If we chop 20 years out of that as a program, that just sounds really challenging. And the issue here is it's not just an individual local authority. There are many out there who have adopted exactly the same approach. So I think there's a lot of work to do to understand how we can help and support local authorities with that ambition, albeit recognizing that it might not be deliverable. The cold hard facts of it, just in terms of having the resource, the skills, and that we're going through the electrification of transport and so on and so forth. So I think, again, it just comes back to really good conversations about the art of the possible. In terms of that conflict between policy positions, I think a lot of this boils down to precisely what an individual organisation or authority might have as their net zero position. So it could be that it's just their commercial operation, if you like. It's their businesses. So that will lead you to do certain things. If it's a local authority and they're looking to decarbonise their entire residential portfolio of properties, then the other issue that has to be wrapped in here is around the thermal efficiency of the properties that they need to decarbonise. Because if you don't do anything there, the decarbonisation solutions are quite limited. If you go down a heat pump route and the building is, I don't know, let's just say pre-1960s to pick a figure out there, then you absolutely are going to have to put some serious efficiency measures in order to support that technology and prevent the heat from just leaching out the side of the property. Now, clearly a hybrid can overcome that because it has that high impact heat delivery over the winter period. So that's one solution, but a lot of this needs to be really well thought through. And it's quite right to need a coordinated approach from a national and a local level in order that we make the right decisions and you don't, as you mentioned, we don't end up with stranded assets.
Brilliant, thanks, Keith. And I think you touched on a point I wanted to raise with Matt around energy efficiency, and just Matt, to ask you a kind of similar question around kind of collaboration between the networks and other sectors. How do you kind of engage with other sectors, particularly the energy efficiency sector, given that that's going to be so key to kind of understanding the level of demand that will be required for heating? And also, how do you kind of work with local authorities and wider stakeholder groups to really understand the need for different heat decarbonisation strategies in different parts of your network?
Yeah, so in the first question around energy efficiency and how we interact with them, I think if we're honest at the current stage of how we interact with them, our interactions are relatively minimal. But I know it's something that we, WPD and a number of the other DNOs, are looking at about how we can do more effectively. So on one of our sort of a project around domestic flexibility, there's a specific work package looking at kind of how we can sort of create the right signals and allow sort of energy efficiency to extract the relevant value. And obviously that becomes a more important thing as more and more sort of heat gets electrified. But then also looking at kind of how we can try and be a little bit more proactive and a bit more customer focused in terms of how we engage with them. So understanding that there are sort of certain key decision points where it's much easier to get homes almost sort of DSO ready, and therefore trying to kind of work out what those are and kind of piggybacking on existing initiatives and kind of having the right intervention at the right time when you can get sort of maximum bang for your buck, rather than kind of trying to kind of put things completely in sort of a DSO timescale. But that's something that's some work that we're kicking off, and there really is a question around kind of how far the DSO's remit is. We've got to be clear on kind of what our remit is around kind of efficient coordination of the network and not just trying to stretch too far. But again, the kind of where that sits and how far we go is kind of one of the big debates at the moment, kind of rife and part of the discussions for ED2. The question about engagement with local authorities, I think, is really important. I think I know we've been sort of ramping up our engagement with local authorities, both in terms of kind of how we do some of our future energy scenario planning. So I know Regen do a lot of sort of that coordination and sort of discussion work for us. And actually one of the recommendations that came out of the Net Zero South Wales piece was to kind of do even more work on that and really work with both the gas and the electricity side with local authorities to come up with a local decarbonisation, a sort of a better view of sort of local plans, because acknowledging that just the demographics and geography of different local authorities will push to very different, will make certain scenarios more or less feasible for them. Pick up on that, the initial question around kind of the kind of whether you do things at a national or local level, or kind of and whether that pushes you down one direction or another. I think that's a really interesting topic, and I know one of the bits we're looking at in the Flex, that Imperial will be looking at in the Flex stuff is around Flex and GB report is around that local versus national model, because I totally understand the desire to at the local authority to get things moving. We're at WPD, we're very keen to kind of get things moving and see things there. We acknowledge that timescales are very tight for doing this, as but inherently that does push you down different scenarios, and I think that's something that local authorities and national government need to kind of work out as to kind of what is the right interactions there. Our role is not to tell them how to which direction they should be doing, but we're more than happy to kind of give them the right information so they can make the right decisions. So inform them of the levels of reinforcement that would be required to sort of do sort of things under more or less decarbonisation, understand the feasibility of kind of the rollout of certain technologies and the kind of level of reinforcement needed on the network.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Matt. I could continue asking questions all day. It's a fascinating topic, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. It's been a really interesting discussion, and thank you to both of our speakers today, Keith Owen and Matt Watson, and thank you to everyone listening for all the questions you've put forward. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them, but if we're able to, we'll try and address some of them after the webinar and get back to you directly. But just for me to say that I'll now hand back to Andrew Lever to close the session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hannah, and Keith and Matt as well. So yeah, thank you again for engaging today's webinar. As mentioned at the start, all 3 webinars have been recorded, and those who have attended will be emailing those following today's session. For our future webinars and our newsletter, you can reach those at carbontrust.com. Of course, our GB flexibility work will be progressing over this year and into March, so do look out for updates on that as we go and progress our work there. If you would, in the meantime, like more information from our energy systems work, then you can get us at info@carbontrust.com. And maybe final thing to say is there is a small pop-up after the webinar closes. We would really appreciate your feedback on today's session. This helps us greatly developing the topic and approach going forward. So with that, thank you very much again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.